Can you fly this thing?" The flight attendant's voice cracked with terror as she gripped Maria Santos's grease-stained coveralls, her manicured nails digging into the fabric. Behind them, the Boeing 737's cabin filled with panicked screams and the acrid smell of electrical smoke. Through the chaos, Maria heard the captain's labored breathing over the intercom, both pilots incapacitated. The aircraft banking dangerously at 35,000 feet with 147 souls aboard, preparing and narrating. This type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Maria had been deadheading home to Denver after a maintenance inspection in Phoenix, squeezed into the back row. In her dirty blue uniform, tool belt still around her waist. The other passengers had barely glanced at her, just another airline worker, invisible in her practical clothes and steel-toed boots. But now, as Flight 447 shuddered violently and began an uncontrolled descent, she was their only hope. "Ma'am, please, the co-pilot is unconscious, and Captain Rodriguez is having some kind of medical emergency," the attendant pleaded, her voice breaking. "The cockpit is filled with smoke, and we can't see the instruments clearly. You work for the airline. You must know something about flying, right?" The aircraft lurched again, throwing passengers against their seats as oxygen masks dangled uselessly in the smoky cabin. A child was crying somewhere in the middle rows. An elderly man clutched, his chest hyperventilating. The terrible mathematical certainty of their situation hung in the recycled air. Without intervention, they had maybe 6 minutes before the damaged aircraft would become unrecoverable. Maria unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her weathered hands steady despite the turbulence that sent other passengers sprawling. Her dark eyes, framed by safety glasses pushed up on her forehead, scanned the chaos with an unusual calmness that seemed almost out of place. Around her, people were praying, crying, recording what they thought might be their final messages. But Maria moved through it all with a quiet purposefulness that drew stares even in the midst of terror. "I can try," she said simply, her voice carrying over the engine noise and screaming with a clarity that somehow cut through the panic. It wasn't a boast or a dramatic declaration, just a matter-of-fact statement from a woman who had spent 15 years maintaining these exact aircraft, knowing every wire, every hydraulic line, every system that kept them airborne. As she made her way toward the cockpit, passengers reached out to her with desperate hands. "Are you a pilot?" someone shouted. "Do you know what you're doing?" another voice cut through. "She's just a mechanic." "How can a mechanic fly a plane?" The doubt in their voices was palpable, their fear transforming into something approaching. Anger at the absurdity of their situation, their lives potentially in the hands of a woman whose job was changing oil and replacing parts, not flying. The flight attendant punched in the cockpit access code with shaking fingers. The reinforced door swung open to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. Captain Rodriguez was slumped forward, conscious but clearly struggling, his face flushed and sweat beading on his forehead. The first officer was completely unconscious, a nasty gash on his temple from where he'd struck the instrument panel during the initial emergency. Smoke was still wisping from an electrical panel that had apparently overloaded, filling the small space with an acrid haze that burned the eyes and throat. Warning lights blinked across the instrument panel like a deadly Christmas tree. The master caution alarm blared continuously, joined by the stall warning horn and the ground proximity warning system. The cacophony of alerts would have overwhelmed most people, but Maria's trained ears separated each sound, categorizing the problems with the systematic approach she'd learned from years of troubleshooting complex mechanical systems. Engine fire. In number 2, Captain Rodriguez managed to gasp, his voice barely audible over the alarms. "Hydraulics failing. Controls are getting heavy. I can't see the instruments clearly. Everything's blurry." Maria slipped into the co-pilot's seat, her hands moving immediately to silence the most urgent alarms. The action seemed instinctive, as if she'd done it 1,000 times before. Her fingers found switches and buttons without hesitation, systematically addressing the cascade of failures with an efficiency that startled even the incapacitated captain. "I've got the aircraft," she announced, her hands taking control of the Catefee yoke with a confidence that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The plane's violent shaking immediately began to smooth out as she made minute adjustments to the elevator trim and rudder. Her feet found the pedals naturally, compensating for the asymmetric thrust from the failed engine, with corrections so subtle they were barely perceptible. Through the windscreen, the ground was rushing up at an alarming rate. They had descended from 35,000 feet to barely 12,000 in what felt like seconds. The Rocky Mountains stretched out below them, their peaks reaching up like granite fingers toward the crippled aircraft. Normal approach procedures would have them lined up with Denver International still 40 miles out, but nothing about this situation was normal. "Tower, this is Frontier 447 declaring emergency." Maria spoke into the headset mic, her voice steady and professional despite the circumstances. "We have dual pilot incapacitation and are being flown by maintenance personnel. Request immediate vectors for emergency approach, runway of opportunity." The radio crackled back immediately. "Frontier 447, say again. Did you say maintenance personnel?" "Affirmative." "Tower, aircraft under control, but we need priority handling. Souls on board 147, fuel remaining approximately 45 minutes. Behind her in the cabin, passengers had grown strangely quiet. Word was spreading that the person now flying the plane was not a pilot at all, but a mechanic, a woman in coveralls who worked in hangars, not cockpits. Some prayed harder. Others stared in disbelief through the small cockpit door opening, watching this unlikely figure manipulate controls they couldn't begin to understand, making split-second decisions that would determine whether they lived or died. The aircraft continued its controlled descent. No longer the terrifying death spiral it had been moments before, but a calculated approach that spoke of someone who understood exactly how these machines responded to input, who knew the relationship between airspeed and angle of attack, who could feel through the controls what the aircraft was trying to tell her. How is she doing that? Someone whispered in the cabin. "She's just a mechanic." But Maria Santos was far from just anything. And in the next few minutes, as she guided Flight 447 through an emergency approach that would be studied for years afterward, everyone aboard would discover that sometimes the most extraordinary capabilities hide behind the most ordinary appearances. Maria Elena Santos arrived at Denver International Airport every morning at 4:47 a.m., 3 minutes before her official start time, carrying the same battered metal lunchbox her father had used during his 30-year career at Lockheed Martin. She would badge in through the employee entrance, past the glittering passenger terminals where travelers sipped expensive coffee and complained about delays, into the industrial maze of Concourse C's maintenance bay, where the real work of keeping aircraft airborne happened in relative obscurity. Her locker was number 247. Squeezed between two much larger lockers belonging to senior mechanics who had been with Frontier Airlines since before she was born. The nameplate reads simply M. Santos in standard issue white letters on blue plastic, no titles, no recognition of the 15 years she had spent crawling through cargo holds, troubleshooting hydraulic systems, and performing the meticulous inspections that kept passengers safe. 35,000 feet above the ground. The morning briefing always followed the same routine. Chuck Hendricks, the shift supervisor, would lumber into the break room with his perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and coffee-stained clipboard, reading off the day's assignments in his gravelly smoker's voice. The premium assignments, the complex repairs, the new aircraft inspections, anything that might catch management's attention, invariably went to the men. Maria typically found herself assigned to routine maintenance, fluid changes, tire replacements, cabin cleaning supervision. Santos, you've got the tire rotation on tail number N847FR. Then help Peterson with the APU inspection on the 320 in Bay 7. Chuck announced that particular Tuesday morning, not bothering to look up from his paperwork. And when you're done with that, the cabin crew is complaining about some rattling noise in the overhead bins on the Denver to Phoenix bird. Probably just loose screws, but passengers are whining about it. The other mechanics barely acknowledged her presence. To them, she was the quiet woman who did her job competently, but without flair, who never pushed for the high-visibility assignments, who seemed content to handle the unglamorous but essential tasks that kept the operation running smoothly. They saw her methodical approach to maintenance as a lack of ambition rather than thoroughness, her preference for working alone as antisocial rather than focused. Maria had learned years ago not to correct their assumptions when she suggested more efficient procedures or pointed out potential problems they had missed. Her input was often dismissed with patronizing nods or ignored entirely. "Thanks, Maria, but I've got it handled," was the standard response, usually delivered with the kind of tone reserved for helpful children who don't understand that adults are busy with important matters. The pilots were even worse. They would stride through the maintenance bays in their crisp uniforms and confident swagger, treating the mechanics like invisible service personnel. Captain Williams, a 20-year veteran who flew the premium routes to Los Angeles and Seattle, had never acknowledged Maria's existence despite her having performed pre-flight inspections on his aircraft dozens of times. When he did speak to mechanics, it was always to the men, as if the technical aspects of aircraft maintenance were somehow beyond female comprehension. "Hey buddy, how's the bird looking today?" he would ask Peterson or Rodriguez, completely ignoring Maria even when she was the primary mechanic on the inspection. If she offered information about a repair or potential issue, pilots would look past her to the nearest male colleague, seeking confirmation from what they considered a more reliable source. The flight attendants were marginally better, but their interactions with Maria were typically limited to complaints about cabin maintenance issues. "The overhead bin door in row 12 is sticking again," they would report. Or, "There's a weird smell coming from the galley area on the Boston flight." They spoke to her with the detached politeness reserved for service workers, respectful but distant, acknowledging her competence in fixing problems while maintaining the invisible barrier between those who worked in the public-facing areas of the airline and those who labored in the mechanical depths. Maria's work uniform told the story of her place in the airline hierarchy. While pilots wore gold-braided epaulettes and flight attendants sported stylish scarves and polished shoes, mechanics were issued basic coveralls in Frontier's corporate blue. Hers bore the inevitable stains of hydraulic fluid, grease, and fuel that no amount of washing could completely remove. Her safety glasses hung from a lanyard around her neck, and her steel-toed boots showed the scuffs and wear of someone who spent her days crawling through aircraft bellies and climbing on wings. Work itself was demanding and often thankless. Aircraft maintenance required a combination of mechanical knowledge, problem-solving skills, and physical stamina that few people possessed. Maria would spend hours contorted in cramped spaces, following wiring harnesses through the aircraft's structure, or balanced precariously on maintenance platforms 30 feet above the hangar floor. Her hands bore the permanent calluses and small scars that came from working with tools and machinery, her fingernails perpetually stained despite her best efforts to clean them. During her lunch breaks, Maria would often sit alone in the employee cafeteria, eating the sandwiches she prepared each morning while reading technical manuals or manufacturer service bulletins. Other employees assumed she was antisocial or perhaps unable to relate to their conversations about sports, television, or weekend plans. They didn't realize that she was constantly updating her knowledge, staying current with the latest modifications and procedures for the aircraft in Frontier's fleet. Her small apartment in Aurora reflected the same practical efficiency as her work approach. The furniture was functional rather than stylish, the decorations minimal. Her kitchen table doubled as a desk where she would spread out technical diagrams and maintenance schedules, planning her approach to complex repairs with the methodical precision of someone who understood that sloppy work could cost lives. The airline's evaluation system consistently rated Maria as meets expectations, the bureaucratic middle ground that acknowledged competent performance without suggesting any particular distinction. Her supervisor's comments were always variations on the same theme. Maria completes assigned tasks adequately and follows proper procedures. Reliable employee. The lukewarm praise that marked her as competent but unremarkable, valuable but not indispensable. What none of them knew, what Maria had never mentioned in any job interview or casual conversation, was that she had learned aircraft systems not in trade school or through apprenticeship, but during 8 years as a United States Air Force pilot. Her DD-214 discharge papers were filed away in a folder she rarely opened, along with commendations for exceptional performance and recommendations for advanced training that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond her control. She had transitioned to civilian life quietly, taking the first steady job that utilized her knowledge of aircraft systems without requiring explanations about her past. The mechanic's coveralls had become her camouflage, allowing her to work around the aircraft she loved while avoiding the questions and complications that came with revealing her true background. In the maintenance bay, she was just Maria Santos, reliable and unremarkable, exactly as she preferred it. The hierarchy at Denver International Airport was as rigid and well-defined as the federal regulations that governed every aspect of commercial aviation. At the apex stood the captains, those silver-haired gods of the cockpit who commanded respect with their 4 gold stripes and their ability to make split-second decisions that affected hundreds of lives. Below them were the first officers, eager and ambitious, working toward their own command someday. Flight attendants occupied a middle tier, the public face of the airline, polished and professional in their interactions with passengers, but maintaining clear boundaries between themselves and the ground crew. Then came the vast supporting cast that made commercial aviation possible, but remained largely invisible to the traveling public. Baggage handlers, gate agents, fuelers, cleaners, and at the very bottom of the operational food chain, the maintenance crew. Within that bottom tier existed its own brutal hierarchy, with licensed A and P mechanics looking down on unlicensed helpers, avionics specialists considering themselves superior to general mechanics, and everyone treating the handful of women in maintenance as curiosities who probably belonged somewhere else. Maria navigated this complex social ecosystem with the careful precision she brought to everything else. She had learned which mechanics would actually listen to her observations and which would dismiss them out of hand. She knew that Rodriguez, despite his gruff exterior, valued her attention to detail, while Thompson would rather make his own mistakes than accept input from someone he considered beneath his notice. The key was reading the room, understanding the unspoken rules, and picking her battles carefully. The morning coffee ritual in the maintenance break room was a perfect microcosm of these dynamics. The senior mechanics claimed the chairs closest to the television, discussing weekend fishing trips and complaining about management decisions, while the newer hires hovered at the periphery, hoping to be included in the conversation. Maria had long ago stopped trying to participate, instead taking her coffee to a corner table where she could review the day's work orders in peace. "Did you see what happened with Peterson yesterday?" Chuck's voice carried across the room as he recounted the previous day's drama. Company safety inspector came through, found 3 discrepancies on his engine inspection. 3 made him tear the whole thing down and start over. Cost us 4 hours of overtime. The assembled mechanics shook their heads in sympathetic outrage. Peterson was one of them, a 20-year veteran who knew his way around a turbofan engine better than most people knew their own homes. The implication was clear. if Peterson could be second-guessed by some desk jockey with a clipboard. None of them were safe from arbitrary criticism. "These safety guys don't know what it's like out here," muttered Kowalski, a grizzled mechanic whose belly strained against his coveralls. "They sit in their air-conditioned offices making checklists while we're out here actually keeping these birds flying. Half of them never turned a wrench in their lives." Maria kept her expression neutral as she sipped her coffee. She had reviewed Peterson's work the previous week and noticed the same discrepancies. The inspector had caught improperly torqued bolts on the engine mount, a missing safety wire on a fuel line connection, inadequate documentation of a parts replacement. She had considered mentioning it to Peterson directly, but had learned from experience that such observations were rarely welcome, especially from someone they considered a parts replacer rather than a real mechanic. The pilot crew rooms were located on an entirely different floor, accessible only with special badge privileges that most maintenance personnel didn't possess. When pilots did venture into the maintenance areas, it was typically with the hurried air of people who had more important places to be. They would nod politely at the mechanics, exchange a few words about weather or delays, but the underlying message was always clear. They were the ones who actually flew the aircraft, while mechanics merely fixed problems when they arose. Captain Morrison, a former Navy pilot who commanded Frontier's Denver to Dallas routes, embodied this attitude perfectly. He would stride through the hangar with his flight bags slung over one shoulder, acknowledging the male mechanics with casual waves while looking right through Maria as if she were part of the equipment. During the rare occasions when he needed to discuss maintenance issues, he would address his questions to whichever male mechanic happened to be nearby, even if Maria had performed the actual work. "How's the hydraulic situation on ship 847? He had asked Rodriguez the previous month, despite the fact that Maria had spent 3 days troubleshooting and repairing the exact system he was asking about. Rodriguez, to his credit, had gestured toward Maria and said, "Sandled that repair. She can give you the details." Morrison had nodded absently, received the information with professional courtesy, but had directed his follow-up questions back to Rodriguez, as if the technical explanation somehow became more reliable when filtered through male interpretation. The female flight attendants were marginally more collegial, occasionally stopping to chat during shift changes, but their conversations rarely moved beyond superficial pleasantries. Maria understood their position in the hierarchy, visible to passengers and management, required to maintain an appearance standard that demanded significant time and money, but ultimately disposable in ways that pilots were not. They recognized her competence but also her place, treating her with the distant friendliness accorded to any service worker who performed their job adequately without causing problems. Management occupied their own rarefied sphere, appearing in the maintenance bays only during scheduled inspections or when major problems required their attention. Regional Director Patricia Hawkins was a former flight attendant who had worked her way up through airline operations, but her interactions with the maintenance crew were filtered through supervisors like Chuck, when she did appear, always in her pressed business suits and practical but expensive shoes. She spoke in corporate platitudes about safety, efficiency, and customer satisfaction while clearly viewing the mechanics as a necessary but potentially problematic expense. The passengers, when they occasionally glimpsed maintenance personnel through terminal windows or during ground delays, saw them as anonymous figures in coveralls who represented either reassurance or concern, depending on the circumstances. A mechanic crawling over an aircraft during routine maintenance was invisible. The same mechanic responding to a maintenance issue that delayed their flight became the target of frustrated glares and muttered complaints about airline reliability. Within this complex social structure, Maria had carved out a niche that allowed her to work effectively while avoiding most of the interpersonal conflicts that plagued other mechanics. She was reliable without being threatening, competent without being showy, present without being intrusive. Her colleagues had learned to depend on her steady performance, while never quite viewing her as an equal partner in their professional community. The younger mechanics, fresh from technical schools with their newly minted certificates and eagerness to prove themselves, initially tried to impress her with their theoretical knowledge of systems and procedures. They would pontificate about engine theory or avionics integration while she listened patiently, occasionally asking questions that revealed gaps in their understanding without making them feel foolish. Over time, they learned to respect her practical knowledge while still viewing her as somehow separate from their career ambitions and professional development. This carefully maintained equilibrium allowed Maria to do the work she found meaningful, while avoiding the scrutiny that might lead to uncomfortable questions about her background or qualifications. She had become expert at being overlooked, at blending into the institutional landscape so thoroughly that people noticed her absence more than her presence. It was a survival strategy that had served her well for 15 years, but it also meant that when crisis struck and her true capabilities became necessary, nobody was prepared for the transformation they were about to witness. The opportunity for ridicule came during Frontier Airlines' mandatory quarterly safety meeting, held in the sterile conference room adjacent to the main terminal. Maria sat in her usual spot near the back, her safety glasses pushed up on her forehead, notepad ready to record any updates to maintenance procedures that might affect her daily work. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the assembled group of pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, and maintenance personnel who had been pulled away from their regular duties for this bureaucratic requirement. Captain Brad Kellerman commanded attention from the front row, his perfectly pressed uniform and confident posture marking him as someone accustomed to deference. At 38, he was Frontier's youngest senior captain, having fast-tracked through the ranks with what many considered an aggressive ambition that sometimes bordered on arrogance. His thick blonde hair was styled with expensive product, and his Rolex Submariner caught the light as he gestured emphatically during his conversation with First Officer Janet Walsh about a recent emergency landing in Chicago. "The thing is," Kellerman was saying, his voice carrying across the room the practiced projection of someone who enjoyed being heard, "these situations separate the real pilots from the wannabes. Anyone can fly when everything's working perfectly. It takes years of experience and actual aviation knowledge to handle a true emergency. Not something you can learn from a manual or pick up by watching YouTube videos." Several other pilots nodded in agreement, their collective smugness palpable as they reinforced their own professional superiority. Flight attendant Lisa Chun chimed in with a story about passengers who thought they could fly planes because they had played flight simulator games on their computers, which prompted laughter and additional anecdotes about civilian misunderstanding of aviation complexity. Maria continued taking notes, her pen moving steadily across the page as she recorded updates to inspection intervals and revised procedures for handling battery replacements. Her focus was entirely on the technical content being presented by the safety officer, a methodical man who delivered regulatory updates with the enthusiasm of someone reading a phone book. She had learned to tune out the social dynamics that inevitably accompanied these gatherings, finding it more productive to concentrate on information that would actually affect her work. "I bet half the people in this room think they could land a plane in an emergency," Captain Morrison added with a chuckle, gesturing broadly at the assembled group. "Hollywood has everyone convinced it's just a matter of following instructions from the tower. Pull back on the stick to go up, push forward to go down, like it's driving a car or something." The comment drew appreciative laughter from the pilot section and knowing smiles from the flight attendants, who had undoubtedly heard similar misconceptions from passengers over the years. Several mechanics shifted uncomfortably in their seats, understanding that they were being subtly mocked for their technical knowledge that didn't extend to actual flight operations. Rodriguez, sitting 2 seats away from Maria, took the bait. Come on, Captain, we work on these birds every day. We know how all the systems operate. Maybe we couldn't handle the fancy stuff, but in a real emergency, some of us might surprise you." Kellerman's smile widened, sensing an opportunity for entertainment. Really? You think knowing how to change oil and replace brake pads translates to flying a commercial aircraft? That's like saying a mechanic who works on Formula One cars could step in and drive at Monaco if the regular driver got sick. The comparison was deliberately insulting, reducing the complex work that aircraft mechanics perform to the level of basic automotive maintenance. Maria looked up from her notes, watching the exchange with the detached interest of someone observing a predictable social ritual. She had witnessed this type of professional posturing countless times over the years, usually ending with the mechanics retreating into defensive silence, while the pilots reinforced their superior status. "I'm just saying," Rodriguez continued, his voice taking on a slightly defensive edge, "we understand the systems. We know what all the controls do. In a life-or-death situation, with instruction from the ground, maybe we could manage something. Systems knowledge is not piloting." First Officer Walsh interjected with barely concealed condescension. "Flying requires spatial awareness, understanding of aerodynamics, knowledge of procedures, ability to process multiple information streams simultaneously. It's not about knowing which switch does what. It's about making split-second decisions. With incomplete information while managing a vehicle traveling at 500 miles per hour. The safety officer attempted to regain control of the meeting, clearing his throat and shuffling his papers, but Kellerman was enjoying himself too. Much to let the moment pass. His eyes swept across the maintenance section, looking for additional targets for his demonstration of aviation superiority. They settled on Maria, who had returned to her note-taking, apparently oblivious to the brewing confrontation. "What do you think, Santos?" Kellerman called out, his voice carrying a challenging edge that made everyone in the room turn to look at her. "You've been working on aircraft for what, 15 years? Think you could handle the controls if push came to shove?" Maria looked up slowly, meeting his gaze with the same calm expression she wore when troubleshooting complex mechanical problems. The room had fallen silent, everyone waiting to see how the quiet mechanic would respond to being put on the spot by one of the airline's most prominent pilots. Some of her fellow mechanics looked sympathetic, understanding that she was being set up as an example of maintenance worker presumption. Others seemed curious to see if she would defend herself or simply deflect the question with appropriate humility. "I think," Maria said carefully, her voice level and professional, "that in a true emergency, people are capable of more than they normally demonstrate. Training and knowledge matter, but sometimes circumstances require everyone to step outside their usual roles." It was a diplomatic answer, neither claiming capability she shouldn't have nor completely conceding Kellerman's point about professional boundaries. But the captain wasn't satisfied with diplomacy. He wanted a clear demonstration of hierarchy, a public acknowledgement that pilots occupied a different sphere of expertise that mechanics should respect and not presume to enter. "That's a very politically correct response," Kellerman said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But let's be specific. Do you personally think you could land a commercial aircraft if the situation required it? Not with extensive coaching. From the ground, not in perfect weather conditions, but in a real emergency with all the stress and complexity that entails?" The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at medieval tournament. Everyone understood that this was no longer about theoretical capabilities or emergency preparedness. It was about professional status and the maintenance of clear boundaries between those who flew aircraft and those who merely fixed them. Maria was being asked to either claim ability she supposedly didn't possess, thereby opening herself to ridicule, or admit her limitations and reinforce the existing power structure. Maria set down her pen and looked directly at Kellerman, her dark eyes steady and unblinking. I hope I never have to find out, Captain. But if circumstances required it, I would do whatever was necessary to protect the lives of everyone aboard. The response frustrated Kellerman because it avoided the trap he had set while maintaining her dignity. She hadn't claimed piloting abilities, but she also hadn't submitted to his implicit demand for professional deference. Several other attendees nodded approvingly at what they interpreted as appropriate confidence without arrogance. "Well," Kellerman said with a dismissive laugh, "let's hope your confidence in theoretical situations never gets tested in the real world. Because the difference between understanding how something works and actually operating it under pressure is usually measured in lives lost." The safety officer finally managed to regain control of the meeting, directing attention back to his prepared materials about updated emergency procedures and revised inspection protocols. But the tension in the room remained palpable, and Maria could feel the sideways glances from colleagues who were processing what had just occurred. She had been publicly challenged and had responded with dignity, but she had also been marked as someone who might have opinions above her. Station. As the meeting concluded and people filed out to return to their duties, Maria gathered her notes and prepared to face what she suspected would be a day of subtle reminders about her place in the airline hierarchy. She had no way of knowing that within hours, Kellerman's hypothetical challenge would become devastatingly real, and everyone who had witnessed this exchange would be forced to reconsider their assumptions about capability, training, and the true meaning of being qualified to save lives. The Boeing 737 responded to Maria's touch like a finely tuned instrument recognizing its master. As she settled into the co-pilot's seat, her hands moved across the controls with a fluidity that seemed to contradict everything the passengers thought they knew about her capabilities. The violent shaking that had terrorized everyone aboard began to subside as she made micro-adjustments to the elevator trim, her feet working the rudder pedals with subtle precision to counteract the asymmetric thrust from the failed engine. "Tower, Frontier 447. We're going to need vectors for a straight-in approach to your longest runway," Maria spoke into the headset microphone, her voice carrying none of the panic that filled the cabin behind her. "Aircraft is responding normally to control inputs, but we have significant systems failures and I'll need emergency equipment standing by." The air traffic controller's voice crackled back with barely controlled tension. "Frontier 447. Understand you have maintenance personnel flying the aircraft. Can you confirm your flight experience and capabilities?" "Affirmative, Tower. I have sufficient experience with this aircraft type to execute a safe approach and landing. Request you clear all traffic and have emergency services positioned for immediate response." Maria's response was professional and confident, but she offered no elaboration about her background. Focusing entirely on the immediate requirements for getting the aircraft safely on the ground. Through the cockpit windows, Denver International Airport was becoming visible in the distance, its distinctive tent-like terminal architecture rising from the prairie like a modern cathedral. The airport's longest runway, 16R34L, stretched 12,000 feet across the Colorado landscape, more than enough distance for even a difficult landing, assuming she could maintain control of the damaged aircraft throughout the approach. Behind her, Captain Rodriguez was fighting to stay conscious, his medical emergency compounded by the stress of their situation. The first officer remained unconscious, his head injury requiring medical attention that wouldn't be available until they were safely on the ground. Maria was truly alone in managing the crisis, with 147 lives depending entirely on skills that none of them knew she possessed. "Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing," Maria announced over the intercom, her voice projecting a calm authority that somehow penetrated the hysteria that had gripped many passengers. "We'll be on the ground in approximately 8 minutes. Remain seated, secure all loose items, and follow crew member instructions. We're going to get through this together." The aircraft's instrument panel told a story of cascading failures that would have overwhelmed most pilots. The number 2 engine fire had been successfully extinguished, but the engine remained shut down, creating asymmetric thrust that required constant compensation. The hydraulic system that powered the primary flight controls was operating at reduced capacity, making the aircraft heavier and less responsive than normal. Multiple warning lights continued to illuminate, demanding attention that had to be prioritized against the immediate requirements of flying the approach. Maria's hands moved across the instrument panel with the confidence of someone who understood not just what each switch and gauge controlled, but why those systems had been designed that way and how they interacted with the aircraft's overall operation. She reduced power on the remaining engine to begin a controlled descent, simultaneously adjusting the aircraft's configuration to maintain the optimal glide path toward the runway. Frontier 447, you're cleared for emergency approach runway 16R. Wind is 270 at 15, gusting to 22. Emergency equipment is in position. The tower controller's voice had steadied as he focused on providing the information she needed, but everyone monitoring the frequency could hear the underlying tension of a situation unlike any in their experience. As the aircraft descended through 8,000 feet, passengers who had been praying or crying began to notice something remarkable. The terrifying lurching and violent motion that had characterized their emergency had been replaced by a smooth, controlled descent that felt almost normal. Through the small cockpit door opening, they could see Maria's figure seated at the controls, her movements deliberate and confident as she managed the approach with apparent expertise. "How is she doing that?" whispered a businessman in seat 1-4C, his earlier panic replaced by bewildered awe as he watched this woman in coveralls execute what appeared to be a textbook emergency approach. "She's just a mechanic. Where did she learn to fly like that?" Flight attendant Sarah Mitchell, who had initially approached Maria in desperation, now found herself watching with growing amazement as the aircraft maintained a perfect glide path toward the runway. The descent rate was steady. The aircraft remained wings level despite the challenging crosswind, and every adjustment Maria made seemed to improve their situation rather than complicate it. This was not someone improvising or following instructions from the ground. This was piloting at a level that many professional aviators would struggle to achieve under such circumstances. "Flaps to approach setting," Maria announced to herself, her left hand moving the flap lever with practiced precision while her right maintained control of the yoke. The aircraft's configuration change was seamless, the additional lift and drag characteristics automatically accommodated by minute adjustments to power and elevator trim that occurred almost simultaneously with the flap extension on the ground. Emergency vehicles raced across the airport to position themselves along the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, and airport operations personnel prepared for what everyone assumed would be a catastrophic crash landing, the inevitable result of an unqualified person attempting to fly a commercial aircraft. Airport operations. Managers activated their emergency protocols, prepared to deal with casualties and aircraft wreckage, while airline officials began the grim process of notifying corporate headquarters about the impending disaster. 5 miles out, runway in sight, Maria reported to the tower, her voice betraying no sign of stress despite managing multiple system failures while executing a precision approach in challenging weather conditions. Through the windscreen, runway 16R stretched out before them like a concrete lifeline, its lights clearly visible against the Colorado prairie despite the afternoon sun. The aircraft passed through 3,000 feet in perfect alignment with the runway centerline, its descent rate exactly matching the optimal 3-degree glide path that had been programmed into approach systems worldwide. Maria's scan pattern moved constantly between the instruments and the visual references outside, cross-checking airspeed, altitude, and position with the systematic precision of someone whose training had been measured not in classroom hours, but in life-or-death scenarios. "Gear down, 3 green," she announced as the landing gear extended with solid mechanical thunks that passengers could hear throughout the cabin. The aircraft's drag characteristics changed immediately, requiring another power adjustment that Maria made without conscious thought, her muscle memory compensating for the configuration change, while her eyes remained focused on the approach. Path. At 1,000 feet above the runway, Maria began the final phase of the approach, her hands and feet working in perfect coordination to manage the crosswind that threatened to push them off the center line. The damaged aircraft responded to her inputs with the reliability of a machine being operated by someone who understood its every characteristic, who could predict its responses and make corrections before problems developed. 200 feet. "Runway assured," she announced, more for Captain Rodriguez's benefit than for the tower, who could see the aircraft on final approach through their windows. The Boeing 737 crossed the runway threshold at exactly the correct height and airspeed, touching down with a gentle chirp of tires on concrete that felt like the most beautiful sound anyone aboard had ever heard. As the aircraft rolled out down the runway, emergency vehicles raced alongside, their crews prepared for fire suppression and rescue operations that would prove unnecessary. Maria applied reverse thrust and wheel brakes with the same precision she had demonstrated throughout the approach, bringing the aircraft to a controlled stop with thousands of feet of runway remaining. The cabin erupted in applause and cheers that could be heard in the cockpit, despite the closed door. Maria methodically completed the shutdown procedures, securing engines and electrical systems with the same attention to detail she brought to every aspect of flight operations. Only when the aircraft was completely safe did she finally allow herself a small smile, knowing that everyone aboard would live to see another day. The immediate aftermath of Flight 447's emergency landing resembled a carefully choreographed dance of disbelief and investigative urgency. As passengers deplaned via emergency slides, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and stunned confusion, airport officials found themselves grappling with a situation that defied every protocol and assumption about commercial aviation emergency procedures. The woman who had just executed what veteran pilots were already calling a masterclass in emergency flying was calmly completing post-flight paperwork, while paramedics attended to the injured flight crew. Captain Kellerman arrived at the gate. Within minutes of the aircraft's arrival, his earlier smugness replaced by a bewildered intensity that made his hands shake as he reviewed the preliminary incident reports. The same man who had publicly challenged Maria's theoretical capabilities just hours earlier now stared at documentation that seemed to describe an impossibility. A maintenance worker had not only successfully landed a crippled commercial aircraft, but had done so with technical precision that exceeded many professional pilots' capabilities. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to First Officer Walsh as they watched Maria emerge from the aircraft, still wearing her grease-stained coveralls and carrying her ever-present toolbox. "Nobody flies that approach on their first time in the left seat. Nobody. The power management alone requires thousands of hours of experience, and the crosswind correction she executed. I've seen 20-year veterans struggle with conditions like that." Airport Operations Manager Patricia Hendricks gathered her emergency response team in Conference Room C while maintenance crews began their detailed examination of the damaged aircraft. The Boeing 737's flight data recorder would provide precise information about every control input, every system activation, every decision made during the emergency sequence. But even before that technical analysis was complete, the preliminary reports from air traffic controllers painted a picture that challenged fundamental assumptions about pilot qualifications and emergency procedures. "She never requested vectors or guidance," reported Tower Controller Mike Stevens, his voice still carrying traces of the disbelief he'd felt while watching the approach. Most emergency situations, even with experienced pilots, were providing constant heading and altitude instructions. She called her own approach, managed her own descent profile, and executed a textbook landing without any assistance from ground personnel. It was like watching someone who'd been flying 737s for decades. Meanwhile, Human Resources Director Janet Morrison found herself in the unprecedented position of conducting an immediate background review on an employee who had just performed what would undoubtedly become the most scrutinized emergency landing in Frontier Airlines history. Maria's personnel file, which had seemed unremarkable that morning, now demanded the kind of detailed analysis typically reserved for pilot hiring decisions or accident investigations. Her maintenance certifications are all current and properly documented, Morrison told Airport Security Chief Robert Kane as they reviewed the employment records. 15 years of exemplary service, no incidents, consistently positive evaluations. But there's nothing here that explains what just happened. No flight training, no pilot certificates, no indication she'd ever been inside a cockpit before today. The medical team treating Captain Rodriguez provided additional pieces to the puzzle that was rapidly forming around Maria's extraordinary performance. Despite his medical emergency, Rodriguez had remained conscious during portions of the landing sequence, and his observations added credibility to the growing body of evidence that the emergency landing had been far from accidental. She knew the aircraft systems better than most pilots, Rodriguez told the investigating team from his hospital bed, his voice still weak but his recollection crystal clear. When she took the controls, she didn't hesitate or fumble with unfamiliar switches. She silenced the warning systems in the correct sequence, managed the engine failure checklist perfectly, and flew the approach like someone with significant turbine aircraft experience. Whatever her background, she's been in cockpits before. Federal Aviation Administration Inspector Thomas Chun arrived at Denver International within 2 hours of the landing, carrying the authority to conduct a comprehensive investigation into what appeared to be a violation of numerous regulations regarding pilot qualifications and aircraft operations. However, his preliminary interviews with witnesses and review of available evidence suggested a complexity that transcended simple REGULATORY violations. The flight data recorder shows textbook emergency procedures, Chun reported to his supervisor during a late afternoon phone conference. Every control input was appropriate and precisely executed. The approach profile matches published procedures for single-engine emergency landings, and the crosswind correction demonstrated advanced piloting techniques. This wasn't luck or intuition. This was training and experience being applied under pressure. As word of the incident spread through the aviation community, theories and speculation began circulating among pilots, mechanics, and aviation professionals who struggled to reconcile what had occurred with their understanding of pilot training and certification processes. Social media groups dedicated to aviation, discussions exploded with debates about the possibility of maintenance workers acquiring flight skills through observation and unofficial training. Chief of Maintenance Danny Murphy found himself fielding calls from reporters, aviation magazines, and fellow maintenance supervisors, seeking explanations for how one of his technicians had accomplished something that seemed to violate the fundamental principles of professional specialization. His own 15-minute conversation with Maria immediately after the landing had left him more confused than enlightened. She was completely calm, like it was just another day at the office, Murphy told the gathering of investigators and airline officials. I asked her how she knew what to do, and she just said she'd spent a lot of time studying aircraft systems. But studying systems and flying aircraft are completely different skills. You don't learn crosswind landings from maintenance manuals. The passengers who had experienced the emergency firsthand began comparing their observations and impressions, many of them reaching similar conclusions about the professional competence they had witnessed. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a physician who had been seated in first class with a clear view of the cockpit during portions of the emergency, provided particularly detailed testimony about Maria's behavior and apparent expertise. Her movements were too smooth, too practiced, Dr. Harper explained to investigators. When people are improvising or following instructions, you see hesitation, uncertainty, trial and error. What I observed looked like someone executing procedures they had performed many times before. Her body language, her vocal commands, even the way she positioned herself in the seat, it all suggested familiarity with aircraft operations that went far beyond mechanical knowledge. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. By evening, the investigation had attracted attention from multiple federal agencies, airline, industry organizations, and media outlets seeking to understand how a maintenance worker had successfully completed an emergency landing that many professional pilots considered extraordinarily difficult. The preliminary findings were generating more questions than answers, creating pressure for a comprehensive background investigation that would explore every aspect of Maria's personal and professional history. The most intriguing discovery came from Airport Security's review of employee badge access records, which showed an unusual pattern of after-hours activity in areas typically restricted to flight operations personnel. Over the past several years, Maria had occasionally accessed pilot briefing rooms, flight simulator facilities, and training areas during times when these facilities were supposedly unoccupied and secured. She wasn't supposed to have access to those areas, Security Chief Kane reported to the investigation team. Her badge was programmed for maintenance facilities only, but somehow she'd been getting into pilot training areas during off shifts, possibly for hours at a time. We're reviewing surveillance footage to determine what she was doing there. As investigators prepared for detailed interviews and record searches that would extend well beyond Frontier Airlines' employment database, one fact remained undeniably clear. Maria Santos possessed knowledge, skills, and experience that her official background could not explain. The mystery of how a maintenance worker had saved 147 lives was just beginning to unfold, and the answers would challenge assumptions about identity, qualifications, and the hidden depths of ordinary people who perform extraordinary acts when circumstances demand it. The breakthrough came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, when FAA Inspector Thomas Chen received a classified email that would transform the entire investigation into Maria Santos's extraordinary emergency landing. The message originated from the Department of Defense Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, triggered by automated cross-referencing systems that flagged civilian aviation incidents involving individuals with military flight training backgrounds. Subject: Maria Elena Santos, SN, redacted, former USAF pilot, service dates 2001 to 2009. Request immediate contact for classified briefing regarding recent civilian aviation incident. The email's stark language and official Department of Defense headers indicated that Maria's story extended far beyond what anyone at Frontier Airlines had imagined possible. Within hours, Inspector Chen found himself in a secure conference room at Peterson Air Force Base, Colorado Springs, facing Colonel Rebecca Mitchell, who served as liaison between military personnel records and civilian aviation authorities. The documents spread across the conference table told a story that explained everything about Flight 447's miraculous landing, while raising entirely new questions about why such an accomplished aviator had been working anonymously as a maintenance technician. Captain Maria Elena Santos was one of our most exceptional pilots. Colonel Mitchell began, her voice carrying the weight of classified information that had remained buried for 15 years. She flew C-130 Hercules transport aircraft in Iraq and Afghanistan from 2004 to 2009, accumulating over 3,200 flight hours in combat and humanitarian missions. Her record includes successful emergency landings under hostile fire, precision airdrops in extreme weather conditions, and evacuation missions that saved hundreds of lives. The military flight records painted a picture of professional excellence. That made Maria's recent performance seem not miraculous but inevitable. Her service jacket documented emergency landings on damaged runways, single-engine approaches in combat zones, and night operations in mountainous terrain that required the kind of precision flying that civilian pilots might never encounter in their entire careers. She received the Distinguished Flying Cross for a mission in 2007. Colonel Mitchell continued, sliding a commendation across the table. Her C-130 took enemy fire during a medical evacuation near Kandahar, lost hydraulics, partial engine failure, and had to land at a forward operating base with a damaged runway in a sandstorm. Saved 38 wounded soldiers who would have died without immediate medical attention. Inspector Chun studied the official photographs from Maria's military service, trying to reconcile the confident Air Force captain in dress blues with the quiet maintenance worker he had interviewed just days earlier. The transformation was more than cosmetic. It represented a fundamental shift in identity that had allowed one of the military's most accomplished pilots to disappear completely into civilian anonymity. The reason for her departure from active duty emerged through carefully worded references to medical evaluations and fitness for duty reviews that had been conducted in 2008 and 2009. Maria had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder following a particularly difficult mission in Afghanistan, where her aircraft had been shot down during a reconnaissance flight. Though she and her crew had survived, the incident had triggered psychological symptoms that ultimately led to her medical retirement from active duty. She was cleared for civilian flying, Colonel Mitchell emphasized, anticipating Chun's next question. The PTSD diagnosis was specific to combat situations and high-stress military operations. There was never any question about her technical flying abilities or her capacity to operate aircraft safely in civilian contexts. She chose not to pursue commercial aviation as a career. The investigation team discovered that Maria had deliberately avoided the civilian aviation industry after her military service, apparently seeking work that would keep her around aircraft without the pressure and scrutiny that came with professional pilot positions. Her employment at Frontier Airlines had been a conscious choice to remain connected to aviation while maintaining the low profile that her psychological recovery required. Dr. Sarah Williams, the Veterans Affairs psychologist who had treated Maria during her transition to civilian life, provided additional context during a carefully controlled interview that respected patient confidentiality while addressing the public safety implications of the recent incident. Her insights revealed the complexity of Maria's situation and the reasons behind her extended period of professional camouflage. Many combat veterans struggle with the transition from high-responsibility military roles to civilian careers. Dr. Williams explained to the investigation team. Captain Santos was dealing with survivor guilt, hypervigilance, and anxiety related to command decisions that had life or death consequences. Working in maintenance allowed her to contribute to aviation safety without bearing the direct responsibility for passenger lives that comes with commercial piloting. The revelation that Maria had been receiving disability compensation for service-connected PTSD added another layer to the investigation, raising questions about whether her undisclosed military background violated any terms of her civilian employment. However, legal experts determined that her condition had been properly managed and did not disqualify her from the maintenance work she had been performing. Meanwhile, Frontier Airlines executives grappled with the unprecedented situation of discovering that one of their maintenance employees was actually a highly qualified pilot whose military record exceeded the experience levels of many of their senior captains. The corporate implications were staggering, from liability questions to regulatory compliance issues that no airline had ever been forced to address. We're dealing with someone who has more actual emergency flying experience than 90% of our pilot workforce, admitted Vice President of Operations Michael Torres during an emergency board meeting. Her military record shows successful completion of situations that would challenge our most experienced aviators. The question isn't whether she was qualified to handle the emergency. It's why she was changing oil instead of flying planes. Deeper investigation into Maria's post-military years revealed a pattern of deliberate anonymity that had allowed her to heal from combat trauma while remaining connected to the aviation community. She had worked at 3 different airlines over 15 years, always in maintenance roles, always performing exemplary work, never drawing attention to her extraordinary background. Employment records from her previous positions showed similar patterns of reliability, technical competence, and professional invisibility. Supervisors consistently rated her as an outstanding employee, but none had ever suspected that she possessed pilot qualifications that exceeded their own certifications. Her ability to blend into maintenance crews while secretly maintaining her flight skills represented a masterclass in occupational camouflage. The most revealing discovery came from surveillance footage recovered from Frontier's pilot training facilities, which showed Maria accessing flight simulators during late-night hours when the facilities were officially closed. Security cameras had captured dozens of sessions over the past several years, documenting her methodical practice of emergency procedures, instrument approaches, and system failure scenarios. She was maintaining her proficiency, observed Chief Flight Instructor David Park as he reviewed the surveillance recordings. These weren't casual visits. She was conducting systematic training sessions, practicing specific emergency procedures, keeping her skills sharp. She knew exactly what she was doing in that simulator, and she was preparing for situations like what happened on Flight 447. The footage revealed that Maria had been particularly focused on single-engine approaches, system failures, and crosswind landings, exactly the skills she had demonstrated during the emergency. Her simulator sessions showed the same precision and confidence that passengers had witnessed during the actual crisis, confirming that her performance had been the result of sustained practice rather than natural talent or lucky improvisation. As investigators compiled their findings, a complex portrait emerged of a woman who had sacrificed a distinguished military career to manage psychological wounds, while secretly maintaining the capabilities that would eventually save 147 lives. Her story challenged conventional assumptions about career transitions, professional identity, and the hidden talents that exist within seemingly ordinary people who choose anonymity over recognition. The revelation of Maria's military background transformed the investigation from a mystery about impossible competence into a study of deliberate invisibility and the lengths to which some people will go to find peace while remaining prepared to serve when circumstances demand. Extraordinary action. The formal flight evaluation came 3 weeks after the emergency landing, conducted at the Federal Aviation Administration's training facility in Oklahoma City under the supervision of senior check airmen from multiple airlines. Maria sat in the left seat of a Boeing 737 simulator, facing a panel of observers that included Captain James Morrison, the FAA's chief test pilot, and Colonel David Hayes, who had commanded her squadron during her military service and flown from Colorado specifically to witness this unprecedented assessment. "We're going to start with standard procedures," Captain Morrison announced through the intercom, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had evaluated thousands of pilots over a 30-year career. "Normal takeoff, climb, and cruise flight, then we'll progress to emergency scenarios. The goal isn't to trick you or create impossible situations. We want to understand your actual capabilities and confirm the skill level demonstrated during the Frontier 447 incident." Maria nodded silently, her hands finding their natural positions on the controls as the simulator's visual system displayed Denver International Airport's runway 34L stretching out ahead of them. The cockpit environment was identical to the aircraft she had landed during the emergency, but now she faced the scrutiny of aviation professionals who understood exactly what they were evaluating and why her performance mattered for the future. Of commercial aviation safety protocols, the initial evaluation sequence proceeded flawlessly. Maria's takeoff was smooth and precisely executed, her climb profile matching published procedures perfectly, and her radio communications demonstrated the professional phraseology of someone thoroughly familiar with air traffic control protocols. Captain Morrison exchanged meaningful glances with his fellow evaluators as they observed technique that exceeded the competency of many commercial pilots. "Engine failure at V1, Morrison announces suddenly, simulating the most critical moment of any takeoff when pilots must decide whether to abort or continue with an emergency. Maria's response was immediate and textbook perfect. Continue the takeoff, maintain control, execute the engine failure checklist, declare an emergency, and return for a single engine landing. Her actions demonstrated not just knowledge of procedures, but the kind of automatic responses that come only from extensive training and experience. Colonel Hayes leaned forward in his observer seat, recognizing the distinctive flying style he remembered from combat missions 15 years earlier. "She's executing emergency procedures exactly as we trained in the military," he commented to Morrison during a brief pause in the evaluation. "Same scan patterns, same decision-making process, same precision under pressure. This is muscle memory from thousands of hours of flight time, not recently acquired skills." The evaluation intensified as Morrison introduced increasingly complex scenarios: hydraulic failures during approach, electrical fires in flight, multiple system malfunctions requiring prioritization and creative problem-solving. Each challenge was met with the kind of calm competence that impressed even the most skeptical observers. Maria's hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced efficiency. Her voice remained steady during radio communications, and her decision-making reflected the wisdom that comes from extensive real-world experience. Dr. Elizabeth Chun, an aviation psychologist specializing in pilot performance under stress, monitored Maria's physiological responses throughout the evaluation using sensors that measured heart rate, respiration, and stress indicators. Her readings provided additional validation of what the observers were witnessing through direct observation. "Her stress responses are remarkably controlled," Dr. Chun reported to the evaluation panel. "During the most challenging emergency scenarios, she's maintaining physiological patterns consistent with experienced pilots who have successfully managed actual emergencies. This isn't someone improvising under pressure. This is someone drawing on established patterns of successful performance." The technical debrief following the simulator evaluation revealed performance metrics that placed Maria in the top percentile of commercial aviation professionals. Her aircraft handling was precise, her emergency procedures execution was flawless, and her resource management skills demonstrated advanced training that typically required years of commercial airline experience to develop. Captain Rebecca Walsh, Frontier Airlines chief pilot and one of the industry's most respected aviators, arrived for the final day of evaluation carrying Maria's complete military service record and prepared to provide testimony about capabilities that had remained hidden for 15 years. Her presence added gravitas to proceedings that were already being closely watched by aviation industry leaders seeking to understand the implications of the Flight 447 incident. "I've reviewed Captain Santos's military record in detail," Walsh announced to the assembled observers and FAA officials. "Her combat flying experience includes situations more challenging than anything we encounter in commercial operations. Night formations in combat zones, precision airdrops under fire, medical evacuations from damaged runways. These are scenarios that test pilot skills at levels beyond normal civilian training requirements." The military records documentation painted a picture of sustained excellence that explained Maria's recent performance, while raising questions about why such qualified personnel were working in maintenance rather than flight operations. Her logbook showed proficiency in multiple aircraft types, instructor pilot qualifications, and check ride results that consistently exceeded standards throughout her 8-year military career. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, who had flown as Maria's co-pilot during several combat missions in Afghanistan, provided first-hand testimony about abilities that she had witnessed under the most demanding circumstances possible. Her account offered insights into Maria's character and capabilities that no simulator evaluation could fully capture. Captain Santos was the pilot you wanted flying when things went wrong. Martinez testified via video conference from her current assignment in Germany. I flew with her during a medical evacuation mission where we took small arms fire, lost hydraulics, and had to land on a damaged runway in zero visibility conditions. She brought that aircraft home safely with 3 critical patients aboard, who would have died without her flying skills. The final component of the validation process involved interviews with commercial pilots who had reviewed footage and flight data from the Flight 447 emergency landing. Their professional assessments provided industry perspective on Maria's performance and its implications for understanding pilot qualifications and emergency response capabilities. Captain Thomas Anderson, a senior training captain with over 25,000 flight hours, offered analysis that carried significant weight within the aviation community. The crosswind correction she executed during that landing was graduate-level piloting. The power management during single-engine approach was textbook perfect. Most importantly, her decision-making throughout the emergency sequence showed the kind of judgment that comes from extensive experience managing actual emergencies, not just simulator training. The collective testimony from military colleagues, commercial aviation professionals, and technical specialists created an overwhelming validation of Maria's qualifications that transformed her from an unlikely hero into a recognized expert whose skills had been systematically underestimated due to her choice to work outside traditional pilot career paths. The evaluation process confirmed that her emergency landing performance was not an aberration but rather a demonstration of capabilities that she had possessed all along. As the formal assessment concluded, FAA officials found themselves confronting unprecedented questions about pilot certification processes, employment background checks, and the possibility that other highly qualified individuals might be working in support roles throughout the aviation industry. Maria's case had exposed gaps in institutional knowledge that could have significant implications for emergency response planning and resource utilization. The validation process ultimately confirmed what Flight 447's passengers had experienced firsthand. They had been saved not by luck or miraculous improvisation, but by one of the most qualified emergency pilots in commercial aviation, whose deliberate anonymity had kept her extraordinary capabilities hidden until circumstances demanded their revelation. The transformation at Denver International Airport began subtly but spread with the inexorable force of shifting institutional gravity. Maria's first day back at work following the comprehensive FAA evaluation found her walking through maintenance bays where conversations ceased mid-sentence as colleagues turned to acknowledge her presence with nods that carried weight they had never possessed before. The same mechanics who had previously treated her as invisible now stepped aside to let her pass, their gestures reflecting a fundamental recalibration of respect that extended far beyond professional courtesy. Chuck Hendricks, the gruff shift supervisor who had spent 15 years assigning Maria the most mundane maintenance tasks, approached her workstation with the kind of hesitant deference typically reserved for visiting dignitaries or senior management officials. His clipboard hung forgotten at his side as he struggled to find appropriate words for someone whose true qualifications had shattered every assumption he had held about professional hierarchies and hidden competence. "Maria, I need to talk to you about your assignments," Chuck began, his gravelly voice uncharacteristically tentative. "After what happened with Flight 447, and finding out about your background, I think we need to discuss better utilization of your expertise. Maybe you should be training our younger mechanics, sharing some of your knowledge about aircraft systems and emergency procedures." The suggestion represented a complete reversal of Maria's position within the maintenance hierarchy. Previously viewed as competent but unremarkable, she was now being offered responsibilities typically reserved for senior technicians and training supervisors. Her colleagues listened to this exchange with expressions that ranged from admiration to bewilderment as they processed the magnitude of Maria's transformation from overlooked support staff to recognized expert. Rodriguez, who had previously been one of the few mechanics willing to engage Maria in technical discussions, found himself seeking her opinions on complex repairs with a frequency that bordered on consultation rather than casual conversation. His approach to her workstation became purposeful rather than coincidental, and his questions carried the weight of someone seeking guidance from a recognized authority rather than making small talk with a peer. "I've been thinking about that hydraulic issue on the Airbus in Bay 3, Rodriguez said during their first substantive conversation following the revelation of her military background. "You mentioned once that unusual pressure readings could indicate problems upstream from the obvious failure points. Could you take a look at the system schematic and tell me what you think we should be checking?" The request acknowledged expertise that had always existed but had been systematically discounted by institutional assumptions about who possessed valuable knowledge and whose opinions deserved serious consideration. Maria's insights, previously dismissed or ignored, were now actively sought by mechanics who had come to understand that her technical knowledge extended far beyond standard maintenance procedures. The pilot crews experienced perhaps the most dramatic transformation in their interactions with Maria. Captain Kellerman, whose public challenge during the safety meeting had been rendered embarrassingly ironic by subsequent events, approached Maria in the maintenance bay with a humility that would have been inconceivable just weeks earlier. His previous swagger had been replaced by the chastened demeanor of someone whose professional arrogance had been definitively exposed. "I owe you an apology," Kellerman said, his voice lacking the confident projection that had characterized his earlier interactions. "What I said during the safety meeting was completely out of line. I made assumptions about your capabilities that were not only wrong but insulting. Your performance on Flight 447 was extraordinary, and I want you to know that I have tremendous respect for what you accomplished." The apology was witnessed by several mechanics and gate agents who had been present during the original confrontation, creating a moment of public accountability that resonated throughout the airport's professional community. Word of Kellerman's acknowledgement spread quickly, reinforcing the new understanding that Maria's capabilities demanded recognition and respect from everyone who worked around aircraft. Flight attendants, who had previously interacted with Maria only to report cabin maintenance issues, now approached her with questions about aircraft systems and emergency procedures. Their conversations shifted from transactional reports about broken equipment to substantive discussions about safety protocols and passenger protection measures that reflected their new awareness of her comprehensive aviation knowledge. "Could you explain how the oxygen system works during an emergency descent?" asked senior flight attendant Patricia Moore during a chance encounter in the employee cafeteria. "After what happened on 447, I want to understand the technical side better, so I can reassure passengers more effectively if we ever face a similar situation." The request represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between flight operations personnel and maintenance staff, breaking down barriers that had previously limited cross-functional knowledge sharing and professional collaboration. Maria found herself serving as an unofficial technical advisor to crew members who had come to appreciate the value of understanding aircraft systems from perspectives beyond their immediate operational roles. management's transformation was perhaps the most significant, as executives grappled with the implications of having unknowingly employed one of the most qualified emergency pilots in commercial aviation while utilizing her skills in a support capacity. Vice President Patricia Hawkins, who had previously viewed maintenance personnel as necessary but unremarkable operational costs, now found herself seeking Maria's input on safety procedures and emergency response protocols. "We're revising our emergency response procedures based on lessons learned from Flight 447, Hawkins explained during a meeting that would have been unthinkable under the previous hierarchy. "Your military experience and technical knowledge give you perspectives that our standard pilot training doesn't cover. Would you be willing to contribute to the development of enhanced emergency protocols?" The invitation to participate in high-level safety planning represented recognition of expertise that extended beyond technical competence to include strategic thinking and operational wisdom gained through combat flying experience. Maria's transformation from maintenance worker to trusted advisor reflected institutional acknowledgement that valuable capabilities often exist in unexpected places within complex organizations. The broader aviation community's response exceeded even the dramatic changes within Frontier Airlines. Professional pilot organizations invited Maria to speak at safety conferences about emergency procedures and crew resource management, recognizing that her unique perspective could benefit pilots who might never face the combat situations that had shaped her expertise, but could encounter similar technical challenges during civilian emergencies. Aviation Week magazine featured Maria on their cover with the headline, "The Hidden Pilot, Military Experience Saves Commercial Flight," and her story became a case study in multiple professional development programs focused on recognizing and utilizing existing expertise within organizations. Her experience highlighted systematic blind spots in how institutions evaluate and deploy human capabilities. The transformation extended to her daily work environment in ways both subtle and profound. Her toolbox, previously indistinguishable from dozens of others in the maintenance bay, now carried an informal reverence as colleagues recognized it had belonged to someone whose hands had successfully guided a crippled commercial aircraft to safety. Young mechanics sought opportunities to work alongside her, hoping to absorb knowledge and wisdom that formal training programs couldn't provide. Most significantly, Maria found herself serving as an informal mentor to veterans transitioning from military to civilian aviation careers, helping them navigate the complex process of translating combat flying experience into commercial aviation opportunities. Her story had become proof that exceptional capabilities could find expression in unexpected contexts, inspiring others to recognize their own hidden potential for extraordinary service when circumstances demanded it. The transformation was complete when airport personnel began referring to the emergency landing as the Santos incident, acknowledging not just her role in saving lives, but her embodiment of the principle that true expertise often hides behind humble appearances, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself in service of others. 6 months after Flight 447's emergency landing, on a crisp October morning when autumn painted the Colorado Rockies in brilliant gold and crimson, Maria Santos quietly submitted her resignation letter to Human Resources. The single-page document, typed on standard office paper and bearing her neat signature, contained no fanfare or detailed explanations, simply a professional notification of her intention to leave Frontier Airlines effective at the end of the month. Janet Morrison, the HR director who had overseen Maria's transformation from anonymous mechanic to recognized aviation hero, stared at the resignation letter with the same bewilderment she had felt throughout the extraordinary events of the past half-year. Woman who had become the subject of industry conferences, magazine articles, and training videos was choosing to walk away from opportunities that most aviation professionals could only dream of receiving. "Maria, I don't understand," Morrison said during their final meeting. her voice carrying genuine confusion. "United Airlines has offered you a direct entry captain position. Delta wants you for their emergency procedures training program. The FAA has extended an invitation to join their safety research division. You could write your own ticket in this industry, and instead you're choosing to leave aviation entirely?" Maria sat across from the HR director with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout months of recognition, interviews, and opportunities that had fundamentally altered her professional landscape while apparently leaving her personal priorities unchanged. Her response, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone that had characterized all her interactions since becoming famous, reflected a perspective that few people in positions of sudden prominence ever managed to maintain. "I never wanted to be famous," Maria explained simply. "The emergency happened. I did what needed to be done, and everyone survived. That's what mattered. All this attention and these opportunities, they're not what I was looking for when I took this job 15 years ago. I came here to work around aircraft while staying in the background, and that's still what I prefer." Her decision to leave had been building gradually over the months of recognition and transformed relationships. While colleagues and industry leaders viewed her newfound prominence as vindication of hidden worth and long overdue acknowledgement of exceptional capabilities, Maria experienced it as a return to the kind of visibility and pressure she had deliberately avoided since leaving military service. The constant requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and consultation opportunities represented exactly the type of professional demands that her post-military therapy had helped her recognize as triggers for anxiety and hypervigilance. The quiet anonymity that had facilitated her psychological healing was being systematically destroyed by well-meaning people who viewed recognition as reward rather than burden. Captain Kellerman, who had spent months struggling to reconcile his previous dismissive attitude with Maria's demonstrated expertise, made one final attempt to understand her decision during a chance encounter in the employee parking garage. His transformation from arrogant challenger to respectful colleague had been one of the most dramatic changes in the aftermath of Flight 447. But even his newfound humility couldn't bridge the gap between his values and Maria's priorities. "You could be training the next generation of pilots," he urged, his voice carrying the passionate conviction of someone who had discovered the profound impact of hidden expertise. "Your combat experience, your emergency flying skills, your ability to stay calm under pressure, these are capabilities that could save thousands of lives if you shared them with other pilots. How can you walk away from that kind of responsibility?" Maria's response revealed the philosophical difference that separated her from colleagues who viewed professional recognition as both reward and obligation. Her military experience had taught her that the most important service often occurred without acknowledgement, and that the value of an action was measured by its outcomes rather than its visibility. "The people on Flight 447 are alive," she said quietly. "Their families didn't lose loved ones that day. That's the only recognition that matters to me. Teaching other pilots is important work, but there are qualified people who actually want those positions. I prefer to contribute in ways that don't require being in the spotlight." Her departure date was marked by a gathering in the maintenance bay that reflected the complex mix of respect, gratitude, and bewilderment that had characterized relationships throughout her months of prominence. Colleagues who had worked alongside her for years without truly seeing her now struggled to express appreciation for someone whose hidden capabilities had challenged their fundamental assumptions about recognition and worth. Chuck Hendricks, the supervisor who had assigned her mundane tasks for over a decade, presented her with a wrench set engraved with the tail number of the aircraft she had landed during the emergency. His gesture, awkward but sincere, represented an attempt to acknowledge years of overlooked competence while recognizing that material gifts could never adequately address the magnitude of what had been missed. "I keep thinking about all those years," Chuck admitted during the informal farewell ceremony. "All those times I gave you the basic assignments because I thought that's all you were qualified for. Makes me wonder how many other people I've underestimated, how much talent I've been blind to because it didn't come with the right credentials or the right background." The question had become a recurring theme in aviation, industry discussions that extended far beyond Maria's individual situation. Her story had prompted comprehensive reviews of hiring practices, employee utilization strategies, and recognition systems that might systematically overlook exceptional capabilities hidden within seemingly ordinary roles. On her final day, Maria cleaned out her locker with the same methodical precision she had brought to every aspect of her work, packing her personal safety equipment and reference materials into the same metal lunchbox she had carried for 15 years. Her colleagues watched this routine task with heightened awareness, understanding that they were witnessing the quiet conclusion of an extraordinary chapter in their professional community. The note she left on the maintenance bay bulletin board, positioned among routine safety announcements and shift schedules, contained no dramatic farewell message or inspirational call to action. Instead, it offered a simple reminder that reflected her fundamental approach to both crisis management and daily life. Good maintenance keeps aircraft flying safely. Good flying brings everyone home. Both matter equally whether anyone notices or not. Her departure from Denver International Airport occurred during the early morning shift change, when the terminal buzzed with the routine activity of another operational day. She walked through the employee entrance for the last time carrying her lunchbox and wearing civilian clothes. Her transformation back to anonymity, as deliberate and complete as her emergence from obscurity, had been sudden and dramatic. The aviation industry would continue analyzing the lessons of Flight 447 for years to come, incorporating Maria's emergency procedures into training programs and using her story to illustrate the importance of recognizing hidden expertise within organizational structures. But the woman who had saved 147 lives and challenged fundamental assumptions about capability and recognition had chosen to return to the quiet obscurity she valued more than fame. Her legacy lived not in the awards she declined or the positions she refused, but in the transformed perspectives of everyone who had witnessed the extraordinary capabilities that can exist within ordinary people who choose service over recognition, competence over visibility, and the quiet satisfaction of essential work over the demanding spotlight of public acclaim. 2 years after leaving Frontier Airlines, Maria Santos could be found in a small hangar at Centennial Airport, 20 miles south of Denver, where she had quietly established Santos Aircraft Services, a specialized maintenance and consulting company that served private aircraft owners, small charter operations, and flight training schools. The hangar bore no flashy signage or promotional materials, just a simple metal nameplate that most visitors barely noticed. Her clientele discovered her services through word-of-mouth recommendations rather than advertising campaigns. Pilots who had heard whispered stories about the maintenance worker who saved Flight 447 sought her out for complex repairs and pre-purchase inspections, valuing her unique combination of technical expertise and operational experience. She had found the perfect balance between her love of aviation and her need for professional anonymity. The small team she assembled reflected her values and approach to work. 2 other military veterans, both transitioning from combat roles to civilian careers, worked alongside her in an environment that prioritized competence over credentials, results over recognition. Her business model proved that exceptional service could thrive without marketing hype or corporate visibility. On quiet afternoons, when the hangar fell silent except for the distant hum of aircraft engines, Maria would sometimes pause in her work to watch planes departing from Denver International's distant runways. Each aircraft represented the same fundamental truth that had guided her entire career. Behind every safe flight were countless Invisible contributions from people whose names passengers would never know, but whose dedication kept them alive. Her story had rippled through the aviation community in ways she rarely witnessed directly. Training programs now included discussions about recognizing hidden expertise within organizations. Safety protocols incorporated lessons learned from her. Emergency landing. Young mechanics approached their work with renewed understanding that their contributions might someday prove critical in ways they could never anticipate. Most importantly, her example had inspired countless individuals to reconsider their assumptions about the people around them, the quiet colleagues whose capabilities remain hidden beneath humble appearances, the service workers whose backgrounds might include extraordinary experiences, the unassuming individuals who carry within them the potential for heroic action when circumstances demand it. The aviation industry had learned that expertise doesn't always announce itself with fanfare or demand recognition. Sometimes the most qualified person in the room is wearing coveralls instead of gold stripes, carrying a toolbox instead of a flight bag, working in the shadows instead of commanding attention from the spotlight. Maria's story proves that heroes aren't always the people standing center stage receiving applause. Often, they're the ones quietly ensuring that when crisis strikes, the right skills are in the right place at the right moment, ready to save lives without asking for credit or expecting recognition. Have you ever encountered someone whose true capabilities completely surprised you? Someone who seemed ordinary until circumstances revealed their extraordinary background or hidden talents? Share your stories in the comments below. We love hearing about real people whose quiet competence makes a difference in ways both small and profound. If stories like Maria's inspire you to look more carefully at the people around you, to appreciate the hidden heroes who keep our world running safely, then you'll love our other videos about unsung professionals whose dedication protects us all. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss the remarkable stories of ordinary people who accomplish extraordinary things when it matters most. Because sometimes the most important person in the room is the one nobody notices until they save everyone's life.